Good afternoon. This is Jeff Usher, Senior Program Officer at the Kansas Health Foundation. And welcome to our webinar to talk about the Kansas Health Foundation's Food Policy Council Request for Proposal. With us today we have Mark Winne, and Eileen Horn. Mark is a community food activist, writer, and trainer, and Eileen is the Sustainability Coordinator for Douglas County and the City of Lawrence. As I mentioned, we're here to talk about the Food Policy Council's request for proposal and to provide a national and Kansas perspective on the rationale for creation of a state and local food policy council. All attendees on this call will be muted. At any time during the presentation, please submit questions in the question box of the control panel. We like to keep it muted because when we open it up, there can be a lot of background noise. We are going to record this webinar, and so it will be posted on our foundation's website. So basically, the Kansas Health Foundation is providing funding to publicly appointed food policy councils to support planning for or implementation of local policy strategies that would increase the access to and consumption of healthy food and beverages. This opportunity, we're going to have two phases. Our phase one is an assessment phase, and will provide up to $10,000 per food policy council for conducting food systems assessments, convening, technical assistance and training, attendance at national trainings and conferences with food policy council members, assessing of publicly owned property to identify land suitable for community agriculture uses, etc. Anything that would help the Food Policy Council plan around their efforts in their community. Track two would be actual implementation of the policies that the Food Policy Council might engage in. Really, we'll provide up to $40,000 for civic engagement to inform policy implementation, educating the public about a recently established food policy and how they should engage in this, purchasing equipment to implement a recently established policy, monitoring enforcement or evaluation of recently established policies. So that's basically that's what our RFP is about. I'm sure if you have other questions, we will answer those at the end of the webinar. With that, I'll turn it over to Mark Winne.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and good afternoon, Kansas. It is great for me to be able to share some of my thoughts today about food policy councils, and how that work is going at a local and state level. I can go on to the next slide, I guess. So we have been seeing a growth in food policy councils across the country. I'll be getting into some of the numbers a little bit later. Maybe we should keep advancing this slide.
Yeah, hit the slide again. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Just to give you a little a map of where food policy councils are these days. And this is by no means all of them, but gives you some sense of the how widespread they are across the United States. They run into really 3 or 4 categories. We generally kind of divide them between those that are just local and those that are just state. But local can mean both a food policy council that's focused on one single jurisdiction, such as a city, or it can be focused on a single jurisdiction, such as a county, and in some cases they may be joint city-county. I'm a member of, for instance, of the Santa Fe, New Mexico Food Policy Council, and we are both a city and county food policy council. So both our city government and state government have passed resolutions that supported the development and the support, actually, of the Food Policy Council itself. Let's keep going to this. I've been doing this for a while, and I guess this is what this slide is supposed to make you feel sorry for me, maybe. But I've been at community food systems work, I call it, for a better part of my life at this point. I do work as an independent consultant under Mark Winne Associates. More recently, I've had the good fortune to join with Johns Hopkins School of Public Health to begin the development of a more intensive and widely focused food policy initiative. It's not fully in force yet. We're still in the developmental stages, but I'm looking forward to that, mainly because I feel it is going to really expand the resources that are available to groups like yours that are interested in starting food policy councils, becoming more engaged in addressing food policy at your levels of government and in your communities. I also am an author, have a couple of books. Feel free to check them out. My publisher always loves it when you buy them. And I do have a website, markwinne.com, which has several resources on it that are useful to people developing and operating food policy councils, and I urge you to check that out, and I'll be sharing some of the content of that during my presentation. Let's go to the next slide. So what are we going to try to do today? Well, I hope that I will be able to convey to you, give you a better sense of what state and local food policy looks like. What do we mean by it? What are some of the best practices? How do we really consider the potential of a food policy council? What can it do that perhaps another nonprofit organization or food organization can't do? And I'm going to also, as I said earlier, introduce some resources that I hope you'll find useful. I'm going to be staying at kind of that 10,000 foot level, looking at what has developed in the food policy world, at state and local, that is, over the last many years. And that I'm really glad that Eileen is going to be on board to give you a real close to the ground look at what is going on in one part of Kansas. I also should say that I should have said this at the beginning, and which was to thank the Kansas Health Foundation, not just for bringing me on, but for making this program, this grant program available. It's, while not 100% unique or the first of its kind, it's certainly a cutting-edge activity, and I think it's a great opportunity for groups throughout the state of Kansas to take advantage of. So you're getting off on the right foot, I think. I have this slide up here because, people say, well, why do we have a food policy council? What is it supposed to do? What can it do that somebody else can't do? I use this quote from Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel laureate economist, who basically looked at the prevalence of famine throughout the world and political economies and democracy and so forth. And after a good long career of researching what had been going on, found that famine was rare or really non-existent where democracy was prevalent, even where there were whether a country or a place was in a highly impoverished area. And I've learned the lesson from this over the years, that through my work with food policy councils and with communities and a whole variety of food projects, is that when there are a group of well-informed citizens and stakeholders with a regular place to meet and regular opportunities to inform each other and discuss food issues and to share information that they have, you're better able to solve problems in your food system than if you don't have such a place. It's the way that information flows. It's a group of people who are capable of holding government accountable, people who are ready and willing and able to communicate information throughout their communities about their food system. There's a great power of that shared knowledge and access to decision makers and policy making that is very fundamental to the work of food policy councils, and which I don't find in any other form of food activism. Next slide, please. So just let's kind of deconstruct the terms a little bit. When we say Food Policy Council, sometimes people sort of question me, so well, what exactly is a Food Policy Council, and is what I am doing in this particular place a Food Policy Council? Well, I'm not the final source of all information and knowledge on this subject. But since I've been at it a while, I decided to come up with a couple of criteria that I think distinguish food policy councils from other initiatives, other networks or coalitions or other food entities. And that is that I think they do two important things. One is that they do exist to influence public policy around some very basic concepts such as food justice, equity, equal access to resources and food, and of course sustainability. In other words, that we're looking at a particular community or area for its capacity over time to make sure that there will be ample food available to feed everybody, and that the prices of food are going to be reasonable, and that everybody has access to healthy and affordable food. And I think the second distinguishing feature is that the attempt and the interest in coordinating food system stakeholders within an area, giving a given area, geography, a food shed, or a region, and the importance of coordination. I hope doesn't have to be, too carefully described, but I do think that the tendency of many communities that I've worked in has been for lots of good efforts to begin on the ground, sometimes with government, sometimes out of government, sometimes just coming out of the private, for-profit, and nonprofit sectors. But the ability to be able to work together and identify common problems and common resources, that is a challenge. It takes special effort on everybody's part. And so the purpose of a food policy council is to provide a table, so to speak, a place where everyone can come together who has a stake in the food system to identify problems, common solutions, share information, and begin to try to work together toward some common goals. What is a food policy not supposed to do? Well, I don't want to sound too judgmental or prescriptive, but I think I find myself sort of wondering when a food policy council decides to undertake projects that any one of its individual members might be able to do by itself, and sometimes better by itself. You're not there to duplicate the work of any of your members. You're there to add value to your members, and you're there to add value to your food system. So you're trying to focus on policy. Best example I have is when I was involved myself in developing farmers markets, and I found that I could only develop so many farmers markets in any given year, and it got to be increasingly difficult in some cases. And then I decided to look at public policy, and I began to work with the state of Connecticut, where I was working at the time, and we were able to actually put together a program which later became the Farmers Market Nutrition Program to help senior citizens and WIC participants and later on food stamp participants to give them an incentive to shop at farmers markets. That act of public policy, that form of public policy intervention, substantially expanded the number of farmers markets. So I found that policy was often a more effective tool to achieve my objectives than trying to start individual projects. And I'd say, though this is perhaps controversial, the last not is to probably not a good idea for a food policy council to take on what I refer to as the oligopolistic forces of multinational agribusiness. This can be difficult. It can be a distraction. It's not that someone or some entities shouldn't be doing that. It's simply that a food policy council can usually find other things that are going to be less confrontational, less controversial, and at least at a community level, perhaps more productive. Next slide, please. Let's skip this slide and move on to the next one. Just to give you a quick look at this is when I was working for the Community Food Security Coalition, we were able to conduct a couple of censuses of food policy councils in North America. And you can see kind of the results here. The first column, which we call the old list, was based on a census that was done in 2010, so just a little over 2 years ago. And the new list was done in the spring of 2012, so about a 2-year spread between the old list and the new list. And you can see a substantial growth in the number of food policy councils, by location, local or county or regional and so forth. We also tend to, I have worked with and are formerly with the Community Food Security Coalition, worked with Canadian groups as well, and there's been a substantial expansion there. So we're coming to the conclusion that there's about 193 food policy councils operating in North America as of the spring of 2012. And I can say, based on my experience, because I do a lot of work with food policy councils in North America, that number is considerably greater at this point. So let's move on. This just gives you a quick idea, this slide, of what we consider an active food policy council, those that are in development. And again, this is as of spring of last year. But it does, again, suggest what the growth has been. And yes, sometimes food policy councils get up, get going, and unfortunately don't go anywhere, or they stop working. This is usually the exception, but there's been a minor attrition, perhaps 10% over the last few years. I think that we can begin to improve on that rate, reduce attrition as we become more knowledgeable about how they work and how they can work well. Next slide, please. Actually, I'm going to, okay. One really important feature or characteristic of a food policy council is its relationship to government. How is it? Is it a part of government? Is it independent of government? We can see kind of the numbers here, which tends to, as we see, perhaps tends to favor the independent, not closely linked to government approach as being the more dominant one. When we say government appointed, what we're saying is that usually a food policy council is defined by a resolution or an ordinance or some action of city, county, or state government. So this is this is one form, and it is one that I currently operate under it myself in Santa Fe. I was when I was in Hartford, Connecticut, our city and state food policy councils were government created. Probably created would be a better word than appointed. And then more recently, we've seen an expansion in those kinds of food policy councils that are not as closely linked to government. I would say that regardless of how you, I have probably it's a sort of a difficult issue to kind of deconstruct and be able to explain exactly what the benefits are, but I do think that the critical factor in any food policy council, regardless of whether or not you are formally sanctioned by government or if you're operating independently, is that you have a close working relationship with government. It is very difficult to influence policy when you don't have that kind of relationship. This is not a kind of situation where you're out there on your own by yourself trying to do something and then you decide to go down to City Hall and see if you can get somebody's attention. It's an extended process where you're going to be working with people in government over the course of several years and identifying the policy levers, so to speak, that you can begin to influence. Just to give you one example, not to pick on anybody, but this was a group I spoke to once in Colorado, 2 or 3 counties that were working together to people in those counties to try to form a food policy council. All the people doing the work were not involved in government. They were all sort of involved in nonprofit organizations or some community organizations. And they had done some great work on organizing the community. They had held some food summits, and they had done a community food assessment over the course of 2 years. And I asked them, okay, great, what are you doing? How are you working with government at this point? And they said they were not. They actually, when I talked to them some more, they had actually no idea what government's functions were in this particular place. They had no idea really what policy was, in other words, and how to work with government, which is the entity that does make policy. So that's not the way to go, because you're not going to be able to influence policy if you're operating completely outside of the world of government. So the next slide, please. As I said earlier, we have different names that are often used. So when we conducted our census in last spring, we just were curious, well, what are people calling these things? And as you can see, it's kind of all over the map. But obviously, it's largely about food. Council, meaning some kind of organization, is fairly common. Policy itself is relatively common. But we also are using terms like system and advisory and agriculture. Here in New Mexico, when the State Food Policy Council formed, it was going to originally be called the New Mexico Food Policy Council, but some of the farm groups became a little agitated by that and insisted that the word agriculture be included in the title, and nobody had any objection, even though sometimes some people wonder why agriculture doesn't see themselves included under food, but nevertheless, we were able to work that out. And so it's now known as the Food and Agriculture Policy Council. In Madison, Wisconsin, actually Dane County, which includes Madison, the group there was forming a food policy council, and they was going to be authorized by their county government. However, the county government objected to the term policy, so instead it became the Dane County Food Council, and or perhaps Food Advisory Council, I think is what it later was changed to, because the county board had decided that they are in their right, that they are the only entity that can make policy, not another group. So the Food Council exists to advise the county board on food policy. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to draw your attention to some of the resources now that are available. They're now on my website. They were formerly on the Community Food Security Coalition website, but when the coalition went out of business, unfortunately, this past summer, a lot of these resources were shifted over to me. But a couple of documents that I had the opportunity to collaborate in their development were created by the Harvard Law School. Actually, there's a special project there called the Harvard Food Law Policy Clinic, and they've been doing some great work and put together two documents, one called Good Laws, Good Food. They're both called Good Laws, Good Food. One is for local, and since this slide was created, there's now a separate one for state policy. And by going through these documents, and they're on my website, you'll find that we explain what is food policy. What does it actually mean at a local level or at a state level? And how did it come to pass? I mean, how did it come into being? And how does it operationalize itself today? In a way, it's kind of a primer on law and civics, which I think is good for all of us, some basics. And it helps us to understand the origins of policy and how we get into, say, zoning, and how procurement regulations come about, and where does say a city get its authority to do whatever it wants to do with, say, respect to food. So it could be helpful to many of you to go through it or have it available as a reference guide. So let's go on to the next slide. You can just see some of the breakdown of what's included in Good Laws, Good Food. I don't want to go into that now, so let's move on. and I'm going to skip this one also, please, and go to our Food Policy Council Manual. Doing Food Policy Councils Right was the title we chose. Shows you some of the chapters that it includes, but this is, I would say, a good, hopefully helpful document to groups that are just starting out, starting to think about how to organize a Food Policy Council. Again, it's on my website, and it's all there to be downloaded. It's all free. Just go at it and take it. And I think that it'll give you what you need to kind of get going in the right direction. So, see, we're already on moving ahead. What do food policy councils do? Think about the fact that there is, in the United States, no Department of Food. Nowhere do you have a city or a state that has a Department of Food. Nobody is thinking systematically about the direction of your food system. And a food policy council can become, in effect, a food system planning venue. That is an important function. A group that looks ahead strategically and actually begins to envision what they want this food system to look like, and to share that vision with the larger community, but specifically with your policymakers. Help them embrace a vision for your food system. You envision a food system where food insecurity is either non-existent or minimal, where healthy weight is dominant and not obesity and overweight, where farms are functioning well and viable, adequate food is being produced within a region to feed the population. Those are the kinds of elements that we think of in a vision for a food system. Food policy councils do bring people together, very diverse. This is what we mean by stakeholders, people that have a stake in the food system, all from all sectors, as you can see. They focus on a variety of food issues as well. And I think the thing that we have to all acknowledge, hopefully, when we're thinking about food, is how many dots exist in the food system and how many different ways you can connect them. Health is now on our top list when it comes to food system work. Planning, economic development. Food is often one of the biggest portions. If you take everything from soup to nuts, from farm workers to busboys, your food system is one of the largest sectors of any economy. Of course, education, agriculture, and social services. We look at the long list of food and nutrition programs that emanate from the federal government and that are administered by state and county levels. 15 or 16 USDA nutrition programs alone. That's a lot to keep an eye on and to try to make it work as well as possible for people in your community. They also, of course, look at regulations and budgeting, legislation, programs, and administration. This is kind of the nitty-gritty, the meat and potatoes of government. They make regulations. They budget money for things. They pass laws. They operate and administer programs. This is where you are going to do your work. You're going to get in there and you're going to say, what can we do to make these things work as well as possible for our food system? Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this slide, and I'm not going to use it right on this presentation. Just as I was alluding to earlier, when it comes to kind of the organizational structure of food policy councils, we really kind of looking at two very broad types, those that are created and operate pretty, within or very closely to government, and then those that are operating independently. At some point, look at what the opportunity might be for a state one as well. But in Connecticut, for instance, a state statute was passed. It's as legal as you can be to have a statute that creates you, and that's what the state of Connecticut's Food Policy Council is. In Portland, Oregon, it was a local ordinance, which is about as legal as you can be at a local level in terms of a food policy council. In Michigan, it was an executive order of the governor. executive orders, and sometimes you'll find a version of that at the city level. The mayor may, in effect, issue a proclamation, not a proclamation, but effectively an executive order to establish a food policy council. The difference here is that between an executive order and a local ordinance or state statute is that the executive order only runs as long as that person, as that executive, is in office. When he or she leaves office, which they do someday, in some places they seem to stay forever, but hopefully they will move on to bigger and better things at some point, that order expires essentially when that person leaves. That can cause problems for food policy councils. If the executive who created you is out of office, if the new person who comes in is not interested in food issues, then it kind of leaves you in a state of limbo. And generally it's more desirable to be as legal, as you might say, as possible, and not rely on an executive order. But sometimes the executive order is a more expedient way to go. It doesn't take as long. It simply takes the action of one person. It doesn't require the council, city council, or county board or state legislature to meet and debate and enact the law. So there's pros and cons. The more established you are, the more likely you are to be around for a long time. The more dependent you are on sort of just the political person, the more vulnerable you can be. Also, as I said, food policy councils can be independently organized, as they are in New Mexico and Cleveland, and as we saw from the previous chart, in the more common form. We're starting to see some nonprofit 501c3 food policy councils organized as well. Iowa is one example where they went ahead and decided to organize in a sort of traditional nonprofit fashion with a board of directors, which is elected by members of the Food Policy Council, dues-paying members, even though the dues are fairly nominal. Sort of establishes membership in a fairly precise way, and these are the people who vote on a governing board or board of directors to operate the Food Policy Council. Next slide, please. Some of the early steps of a Food Policy Council are one of them is, and you'll hear more on this from Eileen, but food system assessments. Get to know your food system. This is really what it's about. It's one of the early things, the first things that a Food Policy Council does. It will inform your work. It'll help you decide where you want to put your energy. It will be a way to get the community involved right from the beginning. It will also raise your community's food profile. It'll make food a bigger deal. It'll put food on the public agenda, which is really what you're trying to do. And you're certainly going to be educating everyone, including yourselves, about what the needs are. I always put this little note in here, don't overdo it. Keep the Food Policy Council focused. I have seen some food assessments go on forever, years and years, and nobody does anything. Food Policy Councils should be something food assessments should be something you do pretty quickly using available data, maybe a little bit of on-the-ground research or original research, but it shouldn't become somebody's dissertation. So make it useful, make it efficient, and use it to move your work along. Next slide. Funding, and you're fortunate that you're actually potentially getting some assistance from your foundation. That is wonderful. But here are some other sources for you. Staffing is a good idea for food policy councils. It can come in different ways. It can come directly from a city or county government. It can be a separate line item within a food policy council's budget to hire a staff person. I'd say at a local level, typically we are seeing a half-time person at a kind of mid-level, mid-professional level set of qualifications. Fortunately, we're seeing a lot of very smart and well-trained younger people coming out of graduate schools with the capability of being good food policy council coordinators. And those are the kinds of people that, for whom a job like this for, 5 years would be a great place to start, and at a modest salary. Next slide, please. Here's a few little tips that I think can be helpful. Don't go for like the biggest, toughest issue you can imagine. Try to pick a few things that are winnable, that are going to, at the early stages, what we call low-hanging fruit, things you can all agree on, and hey, well, this would be something, maybe it's not the biggest thing in the world, but it's going to get us going. It'll be an early win, and it'll build the morale of the group. I think it's important to pay attention to communication. You have a website. Keep it active. Keep communicating with people on a regular basis. Keep communicating with your policymakers. Don't just meet with them once a year. Don't just wait until you have some big splashy report to issue. Meet with them regularly. Send them letters. Send the newspaper letters. Send members of your congressional delegation, state legislative delegation, letters saying that the Food Policy Council takes this position on this subject and that position on another subject. You cannot over-communicate. Keep your agendas, your meeting agendas fresh and interesting. One thing I found really works well is to bring in outside speakers who know something about one particular aspect of the food system, somebody with particular expertise who can inform your members and kind of stimulate your thinking about what some good policy opportunities might be. And absolutely bring food. Next slide. Just to kind of hit on a few, I'm going to actually go on. Actually, I'll hit New Mexico just to note some of the things that have been done while these are done at the state level. I think many of them are amenable to local work as well, but they've been able to make changes in the school food nutrition rules to control competitive food, which often is your least healthy food. Effectively, they were able to get a lot of the sugary beverages out of the school system. They've been able to expand funding and a whole variety of support for farm-to-school initiatives, which have become very popular across the country. Since we have so many tribal nations in New Mexico, they were able to get more agricultural support for some of those tribes. And we have, as I know you have in Kansas, many rural food deserts. And that has been a special initiative of the Food Policy Council, looking for different ways to try to address that problem. Next slide, please. I kind of use Cleveland, Ohio as a sort of my poster child sometimes because it gives you an idea of how comprehensive you can be. They first decided to say, how can we change our zoning in order to promote more community gardens and urban farms? And they went through really combed through their zoning code and made changes exactly to do that. And this has been a direction that many food policy councils have chosen to go, to promote more community and urban farming. They've also changed their zoning and regulations to allow people to have chickens and bees in their backyards. These are often very small urban lots in Cleveland, but they're able to change the regulations to encourage that, at least not be a hindrance for that kind of food production. They also looked at how they could use economic development funds to promote more food activity, food businesses, even urban farming. And then they looked at how they could use public purchasing. The money that a county or city has available to buy food, whether it's for schools or prisons or hospitals, and begin to give an incentive for local producers to buy food from local producers. So, and then they went in even further and they started to create this Healthy Cleveland initiative in which there is a major food section. So kind of looking at the whole range of city functions, government functions, and then beginning to see how we can use them to support a healthier and more robust food system. Next slide, please. Missoula, Montana, that's where the University of Montana is, but they did some really interesting work, I thought. They've been able to actually weigh in and actually have a seat on the county's land use board, a subdivision planning board, and as a result, they've been able to become very effective in steering development away from prime farm and ranch land and directing it toward areas that are not where prime farmland is, and in that way preserve farming. They've also they supported a major chicken and bee regulation that actually had 300 people show up at a public hearing in support of that. And it was by far and away the most people that had ever come to a public hearing in anybody's memory in Missoula. And then they went on to map their prime agricultural soils, say, hey, here's the land that we think ought to be protected. And they had 100 people come to a public hearing to learn more about where the good dirt was. So good little examples of some good solid policy work from Missoula. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this slide, and I'm going to skip the next slide. We're getting near the end. I'm sorry if I'm going a little long here. Just to nope, go to the next one. It's under Hartford. This is what I think this kind of ties back to what I was saying about Amartya Sen. This is what informed people can do who are paying attention to their food system. We found that our WIC program had lost a significant number of people in a very short period of time. And we found that the reason was, frankly, some serious bureaucratic incompetence on the part of city government that was running that program. We were able to bring that to everyone's attention, make the changes, advocate for the changes, and restore that caseload. That was important because several thousand very low income, very vulnerable people were at risk when the system was not working well. And we were also able to address public transportation and begin to actually correct the fact that public bus routes were not available to help people without cars and in low-income areas to get to supermarkets. We were able to actually change the bus routes and establish new bus routes. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this one, too, and go right to my lessons learned. I really think that these are some of the basic things that I think have been, for me, the most helpful in my learning, which is that we're about relationships. Policy ultimately is about relationships. It's not about passing big laws, big legislation. That's great when it happens and when those opportunities come forward, but it's about developing relationships with people that will help you make those little changes that add up to big ones. You need to be inclusive of a wide range of interests. Your food system is big. There are many stakeholders. You've got to try to reach out to everybody. You're usually working on a consensus model. You're not taking, party line votes, so to speak. You want to have some good, healthy, robust debate, but you're trying for a consensus. You're spending time to educate yourselves and the general public and the policymakers. This is an ongoing activity. It's not something you do once in a while. You do it all the time. Again, community food assessments are important. It's something you're going to do on a regular basis. In other words, you're going to pay attention to how your food system is performing. You're not going to only just do it once, though you're probably going to do one big one at the beginning. But you don't want it to run forever. You want it to be something that you're always paying attention to your food system. And look for some of the synergy between different levels of government. I didn't talk about this, but there's a lot of program activity and policy work that filters down from the federal to the state to the local. Knowing how all that works as a food policy council can be enormously helpful in your ability to make sure that your community is getting all the resources that it's entitled to. And lastly, leadership and champions. You got to pay attention to the leadership of your food policy council. Don't make the person who happens to get up and go to the bathroom the chairman of the food policy council. That's not fair. We got to be more intentional and cultivate good leaders. And I would say find one or more champions within government, a member of the city council or head of the planning department or somebody who really thinks that your work is interesting and good and important and will be your go-to person. So that is it. I'm going to end there, and thank you for your attention. Look forward to your questions later on.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. For those who are on the phone or are interested in possibly learning more about how to establish food policy councils, and for those who would really like to maybe have more intentional conversations with Mark, we're going to offer some consultation time for those communities that are considering establishing a food policy council. And so the way to do that would be to contact me, Jeff Usher, at the Kansas Health Foundation, and you can get my contact information on our website if you don't have it already. You can either contact me by email or by phone, and we can talk about that, and I'll connect you with Mark. Next, we're going to hear from Eileen Horn. She's with the Douglas County Food Policy Council, and she can kind of give folks the sense of what a food policy council at the local level in Kansas does.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff, and thanks so much to the Kansas Health Foundation for the opportunity to participate today. I'm really excited to be part of this. And I especially want to thank Mark Winne for his leadership in food policy councils. When we were starting the Douglas County Food Policy Council, I think my most visited website was the Community Food Security Coalition, because we were using those resources and those how-to manuals very heavily. So thank you. So what I'm hoping to do today is provide a couple stories about the Douglas County Food Policy Council and some examples of things that we're working on. But I'm honestly most looking forward to answering some questions and to helping other food policy councils get started in the state, because it's a little lonely out here in Douglas County being the only one, and so we'd love to have more colleagues to work with. Next slide. So the Douglas County Food Policy Council was established by our county commission, so it is associated with local government, and it was started in 2009. We have a list actually on our website of all of the goals that we work on, but in general we work to identify benefits, challenges, and opportunities for a successful food system. And we represent a wide range of stakeholders within the food system. Next slide. And this is one of the things that at first, I have to be honest, when I started my position as sustainability coordinator and they told me, hey, Eileen, you're going to have to wrangle this council of 20 stakeholders, I definitely cringed, because we have 20 members of our food policy council, and I was definitely alarmed and thought it would be unwieldy to try to work with a stakeholder group this large. And we took some steps to deal with that, as I'll talk about in a second. But I did want to share this with you all so you can see the composition of our Food Policy Council. This list of sectors that are represented on the Food Policy Council was established by our county commission. So within our bylaws is written these 20 spots. And these were very intentionally chosen. As you can see, we're really trying to represent all elements of the food system. So, our agricultural producers, for example, we have a specialty crop grower in Davenport Winery. We have a small vegetable producer in Moon on the Meadow Farm, and then we have the president of the Douglas County Farm Bureau, who is a row crop producer and rancher. So we tried to be sure that we were very inclusive of all types of production. In our retail food outlets, we have grocery stores and restaurants. And we also wanted to be sure we were speaking to institutional food purchasers, so we have the food service director for the school district, and then representatives from across the community in all sorts of stakeholder groups related to food, from food security to health and nutrition to sustainable agriculture. We have one liaison for the farmers market, and we also have a liaison who is usually a member of our Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors. So we really tried to represent a variety of stakeholders who care about food and whose work is connected to food and agriculture. Next slide. So as I was saying, I cringed initially and was worried about it being unwieldy. And so early on, we broke up into subcommittees, and this has been really, really helpful. It requires additional time commitment, so we have a monthly meeting for our Food Policy Council. It lasts about 2 hours. And then we also ask each Food Policy Council member to sign up for a subcommittee, and those subcommittees also meet monthly, and they meet for about an hour, and they usually meet somewhere fun with coffee or food or beer sometimes. And what's been really helpful about having the subcommittee structure is that these are the small groups, the workhorses that can actually advance things between the meetings, because there's really nothing more frustrating than coming to a meeting and someone's report out is, well, we haven't really done anything since the last meeting, and this subcommittee structure has really helped us to ensure that the work continues between the meetings and that things can continue making progress. So we divided our subcommittees according to this model, where each subcommittee is focused on policies specific to a particular jurisdiction. So we have a city subcommittee that works with the 4 cities in Douglas County and works specifically on urban agriculture, gardens, food deserts, more city food-related issues. The county subcommittee works on planning and zoning, a local food purchasing policy for our county jail, things that more interact with the county level of government. We have a community group that is kind of our liaison with the farmers market, with nonprofits, with extension, with the chamber and schools to make sure that we're in good contact with our partner organizations that are also advancing this important work. And then our last group, they call themselves the Feds, tracks state and federal legislation and policy and connects us with the statewide farm-to-school movement that's happening and potential state and federal funding sources. So each group kind of has their own niche, and they meet monthly as well, and then at the large meeting, they report out on their progress. So it's been for us a really effective way to organize ourselves and keep moving forward. Next slide. Our first step, as Mark advised, and was really crucial for us, was to do a community food system assessment to make sure that we were rooting our policy recommendations in actual data and good information. So you can see in our table of contents, these are the things that we studied. But generally, we wanted to look at what are we producing, what are we consuming, how is it moving around in our county, and what are the economic impacts of that. So those were kind of our key markers and research points. We collaborated with Dr. Rhonda Yankee at K-State University and one of her graduate students, and as Mark said, this doesn't need to be, a 6-year dissertation. A lot of these data sets are readily available through the USDA Census of Ag or the 2010 census data. I mean, there are so many great tools already available that having a part-time staff person or a graduate student or somebody who's just really interested in this who wants to dig into those data sets is really all you need to get good information to get started. Next slide. So some of our biggest aha moments are represented on this slide. When we got the results of our food system assessment, one of the jarring facts was that less than 0.1% of the farmland in our area is devoted to fruit and vegetable production. So we clearly are, missing an opportunity potentially to have more local production. So that was one aha. The map in the middle is a map we created that shows that there are 2 census tracts in the city of Lawrence that qualify as food deserts. And the USDA has a tool to help map food deserts and to find them, but basically what it means is they took low-income census tracts and they overlaid them with distance to grocery stores. And so there are many communities in Kansas that count as food deserts because they're both a low-income area and many of their residents lack access to grocery stores. And so this is something that we were totally unaware of. We thought there were plenty of grocery stores in Lawrence, but this informed our knowledge significantly. Next slide. But the biggest aha was definitely this one, and you can go ahead and click through. There's some arrows that pop up. So we looked at the entire food system, and we wanted to find out, who are the food system distributors? Who's moving the stuff around? So we searched the Kansas Department of Revenue, I think is where we got this data, and there were 4 businesses incorporated in our region that came up as food distributors. 2 were Standard Beverage that distribute liquor. 1 is a Kmart distribution center, and the other one has since closed. So we had no food system infrastructure, and this was something that we wouldn't have found out unless we had done a food system assessment. Next slide. So we took the results of our food system assessment and used it to form our work plan, and it was really helpful then to say we know what we're working on and we have the data to back it up. We thought we were being cute and alliterative with our 4 categories, But these are the 4 buckets in which we organize our work. So planning has to do with planning and zoning and protecting high-quality agricultural land. Produce is about increasing that fruit and vegetable production, especially in those gap areas that we saw. Process is about attracting food processing businesses and supporting entrepreneurs in our own community so that they can start those businesses. And then provide is the overarching idea for addressing food deserts and making sure that our citizens have access to healthy food. And then that bottom goal was the overarching goal for the Food Policy Council for the past 2 years has been really to dig into this question of food infrastructure enterprises. How do we fill in that missing piece of cold storage, packaging, distribution, processing kitchens, et cetera, that are clearly missing from our food system. Next slide. And just to give you some tangible examples of what falls into these buckets, these are some activities that we did last year in each of the areas. So under plan, we worked with the American Planning Association to hire a consultant to come and work with our planning department, with our MPO staff and elected officials, to talk about how do you plan for local food? What should be in your comprehensive plan for your community? What are the ordinances and zoning regulations you should be looking at? And that was really helpful because planners speak a totally different language, and getting one of them in front of the group really made our planning department one of our key champions. And they have since appointed one of their staff to assist the Food Policy Council and have hosted events and webinars with us. They've been really collaborative after we did that. In the produce category, we looked at how can we increase more urban food production, and so I'll talk about the Common Ground community gardening program that we started. Under processing, we've been looking at how to create a food hub, which is that missing infrastructure piece for light processing or local food distribution. And then provide, we've been working with our local food pantry to understand more about where our food deserts are and what policy changes might be helpful for the food pantry to operate more effectively and to get more food to more people. Next slide. So a couple of the lessons we've learned are listed on the slide, and I'm going to go through each one and just give a quick example. But basically, we wanted to ensure that we reached out to all food system stakeholders, that we were staying in good contact with our policymakers and council members, that language matters. I'll explain that one in a second. As Mark said, do policy, not projects, and then building momentum with success. So on the next slide, we really tried to map out our food system stakeholders, and this is a really useful exercise, especially when you're trying to figure out who should be on this Food Policy Council. It'll help you identify who are the major players within your food system and who should be at the table. So that was a really useful exercise for us in the beginning, and it's useful still because when we try to figure out who are we not talking to, who needs to come to our meeting and be a guest speaker, this map has been really useful. Another thing I would say is, one of the things that we've done to ensure that we're engaging stakeholders is we move our meetings around. So each month we meet in a different location. Sometimes it's restaurants, farms, grocery stores, Chamber of Commerce, Farm Bureau, and we invite the host to give a presentation, and that's been really useful for us to not only see elements of our food system and get a firsthand experience with it, it draws more people into our work. And it's kind of created this, we have this group of about 10 people that come to our meetings now, and we call them our food system groupies. But I think it has helped engage other people with our work. Next slide. And as Mark said, it's really important to keep the commissioners updated. We invite them to all of our meetings. We send them our agendas and meeting minutes, and then twice a year we give an official report to them on progress. So, we specifically communicate with the county commission, and that's intentional because they appointed us and we are their advisory body. We've also done public education outreach events, but we haven't found them to be as useful at this point, because when you talk to the general public about policy, it's hard to explain, and we haven't often had an exact go-to that we need them to do, like please sign this bill or please write a letter to whoever. Since we didn't really particularly have an action step, we found that to be sometimes a difficult and time-consuming activity that didn't yield a lot of return. Next slide. So as all of you know, because we're in Kansas, there are two scales of agriculture in our community, and they're very different. And you're going to start talking about this probably in your very first meeting, so it's worth addressing head-on. There are the commodity producers who produce on larger scales, and then there are the smaller fruit and vegetable producers who often produce on smaller scales. And what we found in those first meetings is that we were talking about the two types of farming, and people were using language that in a lot of ways offended, because we often say traditional agriculture, and we're referring to commodity producers. And one of the fruit and vegetable producers said, come on, what's not traditional about growing fruits and vegetables? We've been doing that forever. And it was an aha moment for us that, oh, we didn't even think about what we were saying when we used the word traditional. And the other is that often the word hobby farming is applied to the fruit and vegetable producers or the smaller producers. And that's degrading and demeaning to their way of life to say how they're making their living is just a hobby. So we had to be really careful in the beginning and kind of clean up our language, so to speak, to make sure that we were being inclusive to all types of agriculture. And I put this picture below because I came back from a conference actually that Mark Winne spoke at, and I was all excited about this idea of food sovereignty, where we have this democratic control of our food system through food policy councils. And so I said it in a meeting, and then a couple minutes later somebody raised their hand and said, I'm lost, Eileen. So if we have food sovereignty, is the food sovereign like the Burger King? And it was a great moment for me to recognize that we need to be clear in our language on food systems. Okay, next slide. Since Mark talked about this a lot, I won't reiterate too much, but in terms of our story with the Douglas County Food Policy Council, I have to be honest, this is something that we struggle with still. When you convene your Food Policy Council, you're going to pick your 20 doers in your community. They're going to be the people who are most excited about food and most engaged, and they're going to want to do stuff, and they're going to want to start changing things right now. And ordinances and resolutions and purchasing policies and economic development, that all takes time, and it's going to feel frustrating at first. And so then people will default to what they know best, which is let's have an eat local dinner, or let's print up some brochures, or let's give out, let's do a 5K fun run. And all of that is useful, but not if it detracts and takes energy away from the work that you need to do policy, because as Mark said, there are able-bodied organizations throughout your community to do the projects, but there's nobody else to do local food policy. And so really holding to purpose with that has been hard for us. So we've actually instituted this practice where when someone says, hey, we should have cooking classes at the food pantry, then somebody around the table will kind of self-regulate and say to them, are you going to do that? Like, is your organization going to do that? And put it back on them, so it's clear that it's, that should be the organizations around the table doing that, not the Food Policy Council. All right, and then kind of for my last slide, I'm going to negate a little bit what I said just now about focusing on policy, because this is kind of a hybrid program and policy project, but it allowed us to really build momentum as a Food Policy Council to have that quick win that we were really excited about, and that helped build some credibility with our elected officials. So we launched in early 2012 a program called Common Ground that we surveyed city properties that were vacant or underutilized and allowed them to be leased for free to community gardeners and market farmers in our community. This has ended up being a real win-win, because the gardeners and farmers get access to land and the city staff don't have to maintain them. So it's been really an amazing project. Last year we started a community orchard, a children's garden, a student farm, and 2 traditional community gardens. And then this year we're starting another community garden and an incubator farm for young farmers. So this project has really taken off, and I think it has built a lot of goodwill with our elected officials. And it was, a little bit of a mixture of some policy in terms of writing licenses and dealing with liability insurance pieces, but also it's a very visible product. And so if you can find opportunities like this, and as Mark said, look for that champion. The reason this worked is because our mayor, who's the guy in the blue shirt with the gold shovel, is an avid gardener. And so when we came to him with this idea, he was all over it and insisted and made it happen. So having those key champions also really can make your Food Policy Council be successful quickly. So next slide. Here's a list of some of the resources that we used early on, and there's Mark's website that has many of them. But reading what other food policy councils have been up to was critical for us to figure out what we're supposed to do, because we spend a lot of time being uncertain what the heck a food policy council is and what we're supposed to work on. And by attending conferences of other food policy councils and reading their publications and looking at their websites, then we started to get a handle on it. So I can't stress enough how important it is to look at ideas and see what might fit for your community, because they all won't, but a lot of good ideas can be adapted to our communities here in Kansas. So I might stop there and turn it back over to the Health Foundation folks, and I'm looking forward to answering some questions.
Thanks, Eileen. Please, if you have questions, go ahead and type those in to the question box, and we'll try to answer those questions. If you want to identify who you're asking the question, whether it's me, Jeff, Eileen in Douglas County, or Mark, that would be helpful. So right now we don't have any questions, so we'd love to have some. Looks like we're getting a question. Mark doesn't see that.
The first question that we received is for Mark. What roles has your community foundation played in different states?
My community foundation?
Sorry, what roles have community foundations?
Oh, have community foundations played? They have played a very important role. I don't have a complete list of how many community foundations have supported food policy councils, but I certainly have found it's becoming quite common. Often they're one of the first places you might consider going for, maybe a smaller grant. Policy council up and running. We've also found that I'm actually participating in a process right now in Santa Fe, sponsored by the Santa Fe Community Foundation, which is really helping us to improve our organization and think about how we can better utilize public policy to achieve our objectives. So in other words, they're going sort of beyond just, giving us a grant but engaging us with a couple of other coalitions actually in the area around around how to just improve our own organization. So there's at least a couple of ways that the community foundations are participating. So I would absolutely reach out to them if you have one in your area.
The next question we received is, what would your first step be if you're trying to get the ball rolling in your county?
I could take a stab at this one. I think one of the first steps is to identify a champion. In Douglas County, we had a county commissioner who was really interested in food and agriculture, and she became the champion to help spearhead the Food Policy Council. So I think sitting down with elected officials is a great way to start the conversation about why a Food Policy Council is necessary, what benefits it can bring to the community, and start to have those conversations to see if an elected official would kind of be your sponsor and help you get started.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I sometimes refer to it as the 5 cups of coffee, which are you get together with whatever small number of people who you think might be interested in this idea have already been talking about it. Maybe it's only 3 or 4 people. And have a cup of coffee and talk the idea through and begin to do a little bit of, just sort of inform yourselves, educate yourselves, and then sort of a reaching out to others, maybe putting together a short document, a couple of pages that describes the idea of a food policy council and maybe even lays out a little bit of information about what some of the food system challenges and opportunities are in your area. And circulate that. And one thing that we started to do is to meet with county commissioners and city councils members. And this is where all the other cups of coffee come in. You're starting to sit down with them, bring them along in the process, as Eileen, I think, is saying, and then help them understand what this is and answer their questions and even solicit their suggestions and make them a part of this process of forming a food policy council. So it's those little steps and several cups of coffee that usually get you to where you want to go.
Another question we received is, can the Kansas Health Foundation connect attendees in particular areas of Kansas that want to start or participate in a food policy council but can't do it alone?
Well, we've been, this is from Julie. Julie, you might want to contact me directly. This is Jeff, and my email's up on the board above. Basically, we have 20 communities that are participating in our Healthy Communities Initiative, and we had thought that they might be some of the low-hanging fruit for establishing food policy councils, because our Healthy Communities Initiative is really focused on policies, a policy focus. And so this would fit very well with that. I do know that there are some communities that are interested currently in establishing food policy councils and have been working around food access in particular. So I would be happy to share some of the areas in which we're providing some funds, and we'd certainly be happy to share that information with you.
Another question we received for Jeff: the Kansas Health Foundation RFP indicates that the Food Policy Council needs to be recognized by a government. Does this mean that a local or regional Kansas Food Policy Council needs to be located within a government body like in Douglas County?
That is correct. We debated this quite a bit when we announced this initiative, and as you've seen with Mark's presentation, there are food policy councils that are independent of government but work closely with government, and we just felt that for now, at least starting off, this particular initiative was a means to get to really engage folks in Kansas around the conversation around food policy council, and it assures us that it will be focused on a public entity of some sort. So I certainly would encourage you, if there is an interest in your community around a publicly appointed food policy council, we're not trying to discourage the establishment of independent food policy councils. There are some independent food policy councils. I think Kansas City has a metropolitan food policy council, and I know of course, when you have a regional food policy council, it's hard because you have multiple jurisdictions. But we do know that, for instance, if there is a food policy council that is established, such as the Douglas County Food Policy Council, it has to think regionally, because your potential producers out there, and the hub is not just Douglas County. It could be counties in the region itself. So I don't know if that helped. We also know that there's a lot of food groups, and it's hard for us to be able to really identify which one is really connected to policy and which one aren't connected to policy. And so we made the decision to for this round, at least, until we get more experience, to just focus on publicly appointed food policy councils. Any other questions?
Jeff, could I just make one correction?
Sure.
Yeah, the email address you have up for me here on this slide is not correct. It's an old one. And so one that was on a form, the one that one of my first 2 or 3 slides for my presentation, win5m@aol.com, win5m@aol.com.
And if anybody has any specific questions about contacting Eileen or Mark, feel free to give me a call or email me. And my email address is correct.
And so is mine. And I might just toss out there as well, the Douglas County Food Policy Council, we had a talk at our last meeting about what we can do to support other statewide food policy councils. And one idea that we're working on is potentially kind of a retreat where we could get the food policy councils together, talk about what we're working on locally, talk about state issues that affect us all. And so we are hopefully going to be planning something for early 2014 that will kind of be a work plan retreat for our food policy council, but we'd love to invite other food policy council members from around the state to talk about how we can collaborate and share information together.
Thanks, Eileen.
Sure.
Well, it looks like if there are no more questions, we'll sign off. This webinar will be posted on our website so that for those who may have other folks interested in hearing about food policy councils, you can go to our website soon, and we will have that posted on our website. And, oh, it looks like we got one more question.
The question we have is, I work for Johnson County government. How do I get in touch with Kansas City Metro Policy?
I'll have to email me. I have that information. Eileen, do you know by chance?
Yeah, their website is kcfoodpolicy.org. Their director is Beth Lowe, and her contact info is on that website.
Doesn't look like there's any more questions. Well, Mark and Eileen, thanks so much for being part of this. It's been a great webinar. At least I've learned a lot, and we will be in touch.
Great. Well, thanks, Jeff, for the opportunity.
Feel free to call me anytime, folks. Take care.
Thanks.